And so tonight, what we're going to learn about is the origins of Christian persecution under the Roman Empire, um, the scope and nature of Roman repression, and the varying responses among Christians, because they weren't all the same when they were faced with persecution. And then we'll look at, well, how does it all come to an end and what kind of the aftermath of that is. And I just want to point out at the beginning, again, I said I was a student of this, so I've heavily depended on these resources, especially Wolfram Kinzig's book, Christian Persecution in Antiquity. And I wouldn't endorse everything that he writes in his book, but I thought it was a well-written book. And he approaches these accounts, I think, with a good bit of, he lends enough credence while also tempering some confidence, just because you can understand with so many years of the church, it's easy for traditions and legends to kind of sprout from things. And so there's some accounts, some stories that you hear that you can't really count on, and there's others that you can have more confidence in. So I really benefited from his book, and if you want kind of a comprehensive look at this, I would encourage picking it up, except just noting, like, don't just accept everything whole cloth. So, we named this seminar Christians in the Colosseum. But the funny thing is if you were very observant, probably by the end of this seminar, you'd be asking, so what about the Colosseum? Because actually all the stories I'm going to share with you don't take place in the Colosseum. And interestingly enough, there's no reliable records of any Christians being put to death in the Colosseum itself, which probably comes as a surprise. It came as a surprise to me. In the early 1500s, Pope Pius V claimed that some of these things must have happened there. He wanted soil collected from the Colosseum and stuff. But he had no grounds for claiming that, and further historical study hasn't suggested that anything like that took place in the Colosseum. I didn't read an account about Ignatius of Antioch supposedly being fed to the lions in the Colosseum, but it seems like that's not a very reliable account. So we kind of wonder, okay, so does that pull the rug out from the whole notion of, Christian persecution under the Roman Empire? Can you just all leave now? No. What the Colosseum really is kind of a symbol. It's a symbol of Roman culture and their tastes for bloody sport, and how that kind of roped in Christians, and we'll see that as we go along. But it should also be said that Christian persecution didn't only play out in these kinds of games, but you can imagine them taking place in amphitheaters like this. This is one in Tarragona. It's in Catalonia, Spain. Very scenic, and it's kind of just a crazy juxtaposition, because you have this beautiful scene and 3 Christians were burned at the stake there. And just imagining like people gathering to see that for sport. And if you wanted kind of an idea of maybe what that looked like, not the burning, but the people gathering to see that, I took a little clip from Gladiator, a little snapshot, and you can see like it's not like crazy huge crowds. It's not like NFL size crowds. So when you're thinking about these stadiums, these amphitheaters, you should think of it as being more along the lines of something like McCoy Stadium. So you think about the kind of those small scale stadiums that we would often frequent. Maybe go to see a race car race up at Thompson Speedway, go to see a ball game. They had those kind of things, except they'd see fights, they'd see horse races, all kinds of things like that. So as we are going along in this presentation, we're going to have kind of like 2 dynamics at place. First of all, just recognizing we're trying to cover a ridiculous amount of history, about 300 years. That'd be like trying to cover all of U.S. history. even charting one thing throughout U.S. history would take a long time. So we're going to be kind of taking an air balloon viewpoint, just kind of look at the broad strokes. But then along the way, I'm going to drop you on the ground, and you're kind of going to be right in the middle of it. We'll read a couple of accounts. But it's just just to kind of pause, like think about that, like 300 years of persecution, like as long as the United States has been around. And the Roman Empire was around for a long time. If you trace back from its days as a republic, at a certain point here in this history, they celebrate their 1,000th year of being in existence. And it's kind of difficult for us to wrap our mind around that because the United States hasn't even been around for 300 years yet as a nation. So hopefully that kind of puts you in the right frame of mind when we're thinking about this history. I think one of the best ways to try to connect ourselves with distant events in the past and distant cultures is to make analogies and to see some similarities. So I'd like to make this analogy. Is this tomorrow, America under communism? Probably some of you were alive during the time in which America was very much on high alert about communists. It's called the Red Scare. There was a period in the early 20th century where it was about Bolshevists, and then it just being focused more on the term communism. And there was a communist behind every tree. You had Joseph McCarthy, having all these trials, and they're trying to find out, oh, this guy's actually a communist. And they were calling Martin Luther King a communist, and they were just not sharp on the lookout. Why? Why were they sharp on the lookout for communists? Afraid of what?
Communists coming into the country,
taking over. And look, like terrible things, women being attacked, the nation's burning up. They're seeing it as the destruction of the nation. I think this is a good analogy for us to understand the way in which Roman society probably viewed Christians, not as communists in terms of their beliefs and such, although there's some interesting parallels there, but as seeing them as a threat to national security. To kind of give you some perspective here on just the scale of things, this is the Roman Empire, 117 AD, and there's some play in the borders, but that's the basic outline of things. And you think about how Christians started out. You start off with just a couple thousand people down here in Israel called Roman Palestine, and then they gradually spread out. But even by the year 170, there's only about 100,000 Christians in an empire of 60 million people. And so if you're going to try to make a population comparison today, it'd be like comparing the population of Sikhs in America. Sikhs, those folks that wear the turbans. There's about 500,000 of them in the United States. And of course, there's about 323 million Americans. So you just think about like, how many of you personally know someone that's a Sikh? How many do you see them visibly in your community? It probably varies depending on what community you live in. And it's very easy to see them because they're required to wear a particular religious garb. Whereas Christians were not. And so it's very easy early on for Christians to kind of fly under the radar, especially because they were emerging from within an established religion, the Jewish religion. So just covering very briefly just the origin of Christianity, which you're all very familiar with, emerges within the Jewish religion. Jesus of Nazareth develops a following because of this expectation that he's the fulfillment of the prophecies regarding the Messiah. But then there's a surprising turn. He's crucified, the disciples scattered, and you'd figure then that'd be the end of it. There was all kinds of people who kind of stepped forward and said, I'm the Messiah, I'm going to lead this revolt against the Romans, and then they failed and it all fizzled away. Jesus is different, though, because his disciples claim that 3 days later he rose from the dead. They saw him in the flesh. There's 500 others who saw him as well. And all these disciples go out like it's like their hair's on fire, proclaiming that he's risen from the dead, that he's actually king, this one who's crucified, such that they're not afraid about the same thing happening to them. Um, and they do something radical in that they not only believe that this is good news for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. And in doing that, they're taking kind of a radical step out of the norm in which one's religion usually went lockstep with one's nationality, with one's ethnicity. Um, and of course, the Apostle Paul plays a critical role in this. He's originally a persecutor of the church. He turns into its strongest advocate when he's confronted by Christ, and he himself suffers. He gets stoned, he gets whipped, he gets imprisoned. Now, thinking about Paul and what he suffered and what the others of them suffered, there were certain things about Christian belief and practice that led to them having conflict with others. Looking at the level of the empire, you have competing claims of a gospel. That the Christians actually kind of stole that term, and not in a bad way. It's just they appropriated the term. Because euangelion was, which means good news, was actually an imperial term used by the Caesars to announce good news about their reign and rule. And it's interesting because they would actually claim titles like Son of God and Savior and Lord for themselves. And so they're claiming this. Meanwhile, Christians are saying, well, actually, Jesus is Lord and Savior. So you can see how those things would come into conflict with one another. So they're doing that. That'd be one way that they would disturb kind of Roman society. The other things that you see them early on in the case of Paul, and those are initial missionary journeys, they're disturbing Roman society because they interfere with some of the idol trade because people stop pursuing idols. They upset the Jewish population. And so some of those initial persecutions that you see are stemming from just disturbances of the peace. And the Romans don't like that. They don't like it when the peace is disturbed, and so they'd clamp down. But the Romans at this point still are in the midst of figuring all this out and realizing, like, hey, we don't like that. Initially, it's just like, okay, you're making chaos here. We don't like that. Please get out of town. Another thing that would have been troublesome about Christian belief is that Jesus was crucified. So he's a Roman criminal. The guy who's at the center of your religion is a Roman criminal. A little bit suspect there. The resurrection of the dead. Especially when you're looking at Gentile philosophy, looking at like the philosophy of Plato, the notion that it would be good for our bodies to be restored to life seemed utterly ridiculous. Their conception of the physical world tended to be that the material world is bad. It's something that we want to escape, that spiritual existence is something that's more desirable. And so it's just a weird belief to them, very foreign. Something else with the Christians is that they collapse the differences between races and also classes. And the class piece is probably most disturbing to Roman society. The idea that you would have, a rich noble sitting alongside a slave and them calling each other brothers or sisters, as it were. Very disturbing to them. Exclusive monotheism, that is, they only worship one God, like the Jews. Romans didn't really like that because they are a society in which they worship many gods. They're polytheistic. But unlike the Jews, because the Romans had accommodated the Jews, they said, all right, you can do your thing as long as, in your sacrifices, say you're making a sacrifice like towards the health of our emperor, but it's to your God. And they basically found a workaround for it, and they said, okay, we're grandfathering you in. The Romans did not like anything that was new. Any kind of new philosophies, religions, put them on red alert. And that's exactly what the Christians were. They were something new. Now, it took a while for them to figure that out because, again, they emerged from within Judaism. Along those lines, there's something new. They are proselytizing. They want others to join them. That's disturbing. And they also had these what seemed to be kind of secret gatherings and rites, Lord's Supper, baptism. And so anyone that became a Christian, that became part of the church, it ended up affecting their participation in society. So if you're a sculptor and you're a Christian, you're no longer allowed to make idols. If you're an actor, you're not supposed to act out certain pagan myths. If you're teachers, you're not supposed to teach the kids some of these pagan beliefs. If you're civil magistrates or soldiers, you're not supposed to participate in any kind of cultic sacrifices. So, I mean, those are all, especially the teachers and like the civil magistrates, soldiers, like that's some of your like core workers. Lots of people in our church fulfill those positions. So to say like you're going to have to put a clause on your ability to fulfill your role in those positions, going to create conflict. Romans won't like that. Now, unfortunately, there's so many scriptures we could pull up to explain kind of like why the Christians were ready to make this sort of resistance in the face of the societal pressure, but just a few quick verses. Jesus calls his disciples to deny themselves and take up a cross and follow him. So following Jesus' example, being willing to be, kind of fly in the face of the Roman authorities and just go to a cross. You look at his Sermon on the Mount in the Beatitudes. One of the things he says is, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. So they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And then you see later on when Peter and John are challenged by the Sanhedrin, they're telling him, "Hey, stop preaching this gospel." And they basically say, "Well, do what you got to do, but we're going to do what God's telling us to do." So willingness to not just go along with what the authorities are saying. And then this is a real critical one. Paul instructing the Corinthians saying, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons." Basically saying they cannot participate in the pagan feasts, these sacrifices, because part of the sacrificial process entailed eating some of the sacrificial meat or drinking wine or pouring out a libation. You can't do that. You have to cut yourself off from that. Now, there were some beliefs that were amenable to them being kind of counted as good citizens. Remember, Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Christians are called to a moral, charitable life. That's the thing that's really striking about them. They care for the poor. Even when there's radical plagues going on in the empire, they stick around and care for people rather than just looking out for themselves. And also that through, in the New Testament, they're called to pray for governmental authorities and to respect those authorities and try to maintain the peace. The apostles with Paul and Peter seem to go to great lengths to try to be a good citizen here. Only if you're going to be persecuted for anything, only be it because you're a follower of Christ, not because you're a criminal or something like that. Now, so you have all that, and then set against that is the concerns that the Romans would have in the face of all that. Hearing this notion that there's only one God and you can only worship him led the Roman authorities, the Roman populace altogether, to label Christians as atheists. Which seems kind of funny to us because we say, well, that means you don't believe in any God. But for them, if you denied all the other gods and only worshiped one God, you were effectively an atheist. Which is kind of, it's a funny parallel because, communists are atheists, and that was one of the big charges in the Red Scare. They're introducing atheism into our country. A big to-do about that. Similar thing in Roman society. They saw the Christians, and they're saying that they're promoting atheism. They're promoting the neglect of the Roman gods. And in fact, they saw this as a matter of national security. That if they did not serve and sacrifice to the Romans gods, it would displease those gods and have terrible consequences for the empire. Now, for us, like that seems like maybe kind of a funny notion, maybe, but maybe just put yourself in this position. Imagine if someone came into our church and decided we're going to set up a Buddha in your sanctuary, a statue, big golden statue of Buddha. Now, maybe initially, if someone just rushes in there and does that, you're going to think like, okay, well, God's not going to, if someone just forced themselves upon us and did that, we're going to take it out right away. It'll be okay. But imagine if we just decide we'll just let that stay in the sanctuary. Wouldn't most of us here start to think like God might bring some judgment on us, or at least remove his hand of care upon us? Yeah. The Romans viewed their world in the same way, except it wasn't limited to the sphere of their temples. It encompassed the entirety of the empire. So their fear is that if they allowed these Christians to basically offend the gods by not offering sacrifice, it was going to bring terrible ramifications to the empire. And this led the populace to assign blame to the Christians whenever disasters would arise. If they lost a battle, if there was an earthquake. I think there was, in the early 200s, there was an earthquake that took place in Turkey, coincidentally enough. You think about this earthquake that took place recently. Nowadays they say, it's the government, they didn't have good coding standards and stuff. But back then they would have said, someone displeased the gods. And there's these people over here who are not serving and worshiping the gods. So it must be them. They're the reason why my mom and dad and brother and sister died. Very upsetting. And so when plagues and stuff like this happen, you'd see often it would come down on Christians. Included amongst this idea of displeasing the gods was the fact that it would indicate disloyalty to the emperor, because the Roman emperors cast themselves as God. And in fact, there was this Roman imperial cult where they'd actually offer sacrifices to the emperor, that the emperor would have his own temple. And so if you're looking at it from the emperor's perspective, there's kind of both things. There's two things going on. On the one hand, you have the religious concern, assuming that they sincerely believe that these gods exist and it's going to affect the empire. So they're concerned on that level. But also politically speaking, what these Christians are indicating is they can't even show just a small amount of loyalty to you by just offering a little sacrifice. From their perspective, they're like, what's the big deal? There's lots of other people who worship Zeus or Apollos or all these other gods, and they have no problem just dropping a little incense to me. But these Christians refuse to even just do that little bit. Why won't they capitulate? And so it looks like these Christians might be a disloyal faction within the empire. Something else I was suspicious is they'd have these love feasts. It's basically our version of potlucks. And the Roman populace, they heard about this and they thought that orgies were going on, particularly incestuous orgies, because they would hear Christians refer to each other as brother and sister, and they took that very literally. And because they met in secret, it just made everything kind of suspect. They heard about the Lord's Supper and they think there's cannibalism going on because you're talking about the body and blood of Jesus. And so, on the whole, what the Christians are representing is just a disruption to the social order by their refusal to participate in these sacrifices, and also by, as I stated earlier, including people from various classes and kind of removing those lines of division. This is a quote from Tertullian, an early church father, kind of to that point of how they would lay blame on the Christians. He says, "If the Tiber rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not rise to the fields, if weather will not change, if there's an earthquake, a famine, a plague, straight away the cry is heard, toss the Christian to the lion." it's really interesting to see like how these things are ongoing, and you have these Christians kind of writing back against the injustices that they're facing. We'll pick up on that in just a second. I guess I'm just going to jump to the pictures because it looks like there was a little duplicate here. This is an engraving of Marcus Aurelius. He's in front of the temple of Jupiter, and they're offering sacrifice. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, and they're offering a sacrifice celebrating their victory, I think, over some Germanic tribes. So this again, this idea that the Roman gods gave them favor in their national ambitions. One way in which you can see indications of kind of the disdain that the Roman populace had for Christians is found in this graffiti. This is found on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and in Greek it says Alexamenos worships God, and they are depicting Christ as a donkey, basically. That's how ridiculous they thought the notion of a crucified God was. So to kind of look at some of the actual text, some of the actual thinking behind the Romans when it came to their assessment of Christians, it's useful to look at this fellow Celsus. He's living around 175 AD, and he wrote this work called On the True Doctrine, and it's kind of a critique of Christian belief and practice. His work doesn't exist anymore, so only way that we're able to access some of the things that he wrote was in a response that the Christian church leader Origen wrote. And so he kind of collecting all those pieces, we're able to kind of get a sense of what he was saying against the Christians. So I've taken a few selections of what he says. One of the things he says is, these most rustic of mankind carefully incite young boys to wickedness and women to forsake their fathers and teachers and following them, calling those teachers triflers and fools who teach better things. And it seems like a weird charge to make, but he goes on to basically say that that they're leading people into wickedness because they say that sinners are welcome, that Christ came for sinners. He says, well, that's ridiculous. Why didn't Christ come for the good people? In his opinion of Jews and Christians, he calls them all of them are like to a flight of bats, or to a swarm of ants issuing out of their nest, or to frogs holding counsel in a marsh, or to worms crawling together in the corner of a dunghill and quarreling with one another as to which of them were the greater sinners, and asserting that God shows and announces to themselves all things beforehand, and that abandoning the whole world and regions of heavens and this great earth, he become a citizen among themselves alone, and to themselves alone, makes his intimations, and does not cease sending and inquiring in what way they may be associated with him forever. So a lot of text there to kind of sort out, but the heart of it is this: what Celsus is protesting against is this notion that God has exclusively revealed himself to the Jews and to the Christians, and that the Romans have been in the dark all this time and mistaken about their beliefs about, their pagan gods. This is an interesting response that he gives, basically pushing it back against their refusal to participate in these compulsory sacrifices. He says, God is the God of all light. He is good. He stands in need of nothing, and he is without jealousy. What then is there to hinder those who are most devoted to his service from taking part in public feasts and offering holy sacrifices? If these idols are nothing, what harm will there be in taking part in the feasts? On the other hand, if they are demons, it is certain that they too are God's creatures and belong to God, and that we must believe in them, sacrifice to them according to the laws, and pray to them that they may be propitious. So his term demons is basically the term for the Roman gods. And he believed that, these gods, these demons were behind everything, kind of acting as servants of God. And so that if they truly exist, then the Christians should sacrifice to them in order to please them, say thank you, basically, keep it on. But on the other hand, if it's nothing, then what's the big deal? What's the big deal with participating in these feasts? Now, you heard what Paul said. He said, yeah, they're not really gods, they're demons. But he has a much more, he understands that the demons are a malevolent force. They're rebellious. They're beings that are in rebellion against God. And that's why we should have nothing to do with them. Celsus thinks this is ridiculous. Be more open-minded, basically, and do what you ought to do. Be grateful, basically, for them. And by the time you get to some of his later words, you can see how he kind of gets to a pretty brutal conclusion. He says, basically, if they refuse to do all this, let them leave no posterity behind them, and be driven with all haste out of life, that such a race may become extinct from the face of the earth. And then he says, if the Christians were to persist, suppose if all were to do the same as you surely do not say that if the Romans were in compliance with your wish to neglect their customary duties to God and men, and to worship the Most High, or whatever you please to call him, that he will come down and fight for them, so that they shall need no other help than this. For this same God, as you yourself say, promised of old this and much more to those who served him, and see in what way he has helped them in you. So now he's making a critique here. He's saying, okay, you say that your God cares for you, but how about this? They, in place of being masters of the whole world, are left with not so much as a patch of ground to call home. It seems that he's referring to the Jews here. And as for you, if any of you transgresses even in secret, he is sought out and punished with death. So he's basically saying, you're being persecuted. Where's your God to protect you? What would happen if the Romans, so this is the kind of question of national security here, if the Romans were persuaded to adopt the principles of the Christians, to despise the duties paid to the recognized gods and to men, and to worship the Most High? This is the concern here, that basically what's happening to you is going to happen to us if we follow your path. And then this is the last one. He basically says that, well, if you were to persuade others to follow in your way, hopefully, eventually, when all who have yielded to your persuasion have been taken, some prudent ruler shall rise with a foresight of what is impending, and he will destroy you all utterly before he himself perishes. The basic prescription that he's giving here is it's better to destroy these Christians, get them out of the way before they cause more trouble. So hopefully this kind of gives you a little bit of insight as to why they were so much against the Christians. They thought they were a huge threat against the empire, and that they were going to bring disaster upon them. Part of the Christian response to all this, to this pressure, was in order to become a Christian, you had to go through a longer process. It's interesting, in the New Testament, you see people basically express faith, and then they're automatically baptized, like boom, boom. Later on, you're going like just 100 years out, they introduce a much longer process. This catechumenate process in which they have to be trained for 3 years, basically put through boot camp until they will be allowed to be baptized and take the Lord's Supper and really become a full part of the church. Why? Because they wanted to make sure that you were really in it and that this wasn't just a passing fancy. Because they knew what the kind of pressures that these people were going to face. The other thing that they did was that they engaged in apologetics. Now, some of you have heard that term before. It means the defense of the faith. And they did defend the faith on theological grounds, on philosophical grounds. But they also defended the faith in other regards as well, in terms of Christian character. Basically disputing the claims that the Romans were making against them, justifying the persecution of the Christians. Basically, are pushing back, saying, you have no right to kill us and execute us and do all these things to us. One of the most famous and earliest apologists is this fellow named Justin Martyr. And the reason why he's called Martyr is because he's eventually killed. We'll see his story later. This text is really small, but basically what he's calling for them to do here is to just that they pass judgment after an accurate and searching investigation. To just be fair and even-handed. But then you see him like assert a little bit of like, you can't stop us kind of thing here. And he says, and you can kill but not hurt us. And then he says, but lest anyone think that this is an unreasonable and reckless utterance, we demand that the charges against the Christians be investigated, and that if these be substantiated, they be punished as they deserve. For rather, indeed, we ourselves will punish them, But if no one can convict us of anything, true reason forbids you, for the sake of a wicked rumor, to wrong blameless men. So they're trying their bestest to defend themselves, but with little success. The other thing that they did is they offered assurances of imperial loyalty. I won't read all this, but basically this is a prayer that Clement of Rome offers in one of his letters on behalf of rulers. And as you look at the words there, you can see how it's basically indicating all kinds of well wishes for the government insofar as they are administering their government justly. So kind of looking at just a really basic timeline and scope for through this Roman persecution. First thing that we got to recognize is that for pretty much half of the 300 years that we're covering, most of the things that were going on were limited initiatives, limited to localities. So you have their own empire, but then there's provinces and what they call dioceses. And so governors kind of had their own, like you think about Pontius Pilate, he was a governor. So kind of each territory has its own little things. And sometimes the volume for persecution is higher in one area, it's lower in the others. It all kind of depends on the governor. So you have things going on in the case of Nero. He's an emperor and he has a direct hand in some of these persecutions. Domitian, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, which is a really interesting guy because he's a famous Stoic philosopher. So a very high-minded guy who yet engaged in these brutal persecutions. And so I think, sometimes we assume someone who did this must have been a real lunkhead and stuff. But no, it's like these guys are really sophisticated and really high-minded. And they're like, yes, throw the Christians to the lions, basically. Commodus. And then later on, you can see how it really does follow kind of a timeline in terms of its limits and then it becoming broader. You have some empire-wide initiatives introduced with Decius and Valerian, who followed up right after him. And then the Diocletian Tetrarchy, which was a really intense period, and then which abruptly came to an end. And we'll look at that a little bit more closely. And there's a bunch of other emperors. It's crazy how many Roman emperors there are. But these are some of the most notable as far as it relates to Christian persecution. We can, again, understand that there's persecution going on throughout, but again, kind of at peaks and valleys in terms of what's going on. It wasn't like, the Nazi Holocaust, all 300 years, roping up people and stuff. So the first notable persecution that we have, outside of Scripture recorded is Nero's, and his is quite infamous. This takes place in about 64 AD, and the apostles would still been alive for this. So Peter and Paul. It's claimed, so the city of Rome catches on fire, has a huge portion of the city is burned down. It's theorized that he actually set the fire himself. What he ends up doing is pinning the blame on the Christians. And there seemed to have been a lot of suspicion about Christians at this point anyways, in terms of, their secret gatherings and all of this. We still don't have a clear reason why he persecuted the Christians, but all of the pagan reporters at this time basically were acting like it was justified. So what he does is he crucifies Christians, he feeds them to dogs, and he uses them as torches in Nero's garden. So Nero had this garden, and it's actually at the site of St. Peter's Basilica now. And what he did is, you can see here, he tied up Christians on posts, used them literally for torches, lit them on fire, and then rode around in his chariot around the garden as the Christians are burning on these posts. Really brutal stuff. And again, the only thing that the Christians are known to be guilty of is just the simple confession, which comes up again and again across the record, is just simply confessing, I am a Christian. Which again, I am a Christian equals, in their mind, I'm an atheist, which equals I'm a threat to national security. And so they figure they can do whatever they want to them. He's also responsible for the deaths of Paul and Peter. Tradition says that the apostle Peter was crucified upside down, that Peter asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel like he was worthy to be crucified in the same position as Christ. That's the tradition. And Paul was beheaded. So again, this is kind of just a basic grasp of the layout of the empire, and we have to ask, I want to put you kind of in the position of Roman emperors here, and then also the Roman populace. So first from the position of, just the populace. If you knew a Christian and you hated this person for some reason, how would you expose them? How do you think you might go about doing that?
We tell the government, tell tax collector or somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd report them to the governor.
But you might ask them to participate in some of the rituals of the Romans that is against the faith of the Christians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that gets really to the question of, if you're a Roman governor, how would you try such cases? Because that's exactly what they reach for. They figure, okay, how do we determine whether this person's a Christian or not? If they were to deny the charge that they're a Christian, well, we're going to make them offer a sacrifice to the Roman gods. I gave you a handout, and I'm not going to read the whole first part. I'm just going to basically summarize it. This is a letter from the governor Pliny to Emperor Trajan. And I thought this was worth printing out to you because Pliny's record here gives you a really good just kind of template for how things usually went when it came to trying Christians. And he's basically like, okay, I got this report, of these people that were Christians. I brought them in and tried to get them to sacrifice to the gods. They refused to, so I executed them. And then he's basically saying, I'm hearing more reports of people in my territory becoming Christians. We want to kind of put a cap on this, really want to kind of revitalize the Roman religion. And so he's reaching out to Trajan to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do? Do I just kind of keep steady? Do I become more aggressive? And this is what Emperor Trajan says back to him. He says, you observe proper procedure, my dear Pliny, and sifting the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians. For it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. Now that's interesting and important because he's basically saying that from governor to governor, there's a certain amount of latitude in figuring about how you're going to handle these situations. They are not to be sought out, so no manhunts. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation that whoever denies that he's a Christian really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. So it's an interesting mix of things because you can see okay, this is really brutal. They're just executing people for being Christians. And yet there's this basic concern for a certain level of justice. No anonymous accusations. We don't want to start a manhunt and all this. If it just arises, then handle it and handle it justly. If they decide to sacrifice, then very well. Let them go, kind of thing. And it's clear from all this that they think they're being very even-handed. But it's really a very kind of twisted view of trying somebody. Now, just kind of going through the process of what does a Roman trial look like. Again, you have a charge brought. Sometimes it is anonymous. It's brought to the governor or the prefect. And occasionally, though, it's also got crimes associated with it, whether it be cannibalism, orgies, or assembly. And even in gatherings for assemblies was illegal. And this wasn't just something for the Christians. I was reading that they even forbade frequent assemblies for guilds. And it seemed that the empire had a particular concern about that because they didn't want factions forming a rebellion or something. So they limit it, not all the time, but at times to like gathering once monthly. The only exception to this was the Jews, which kind of gave some early motivation for Christians to keep under the Jewish umbrella. And so if you're reading Paul's letters where he's telling them to resist people trying to get them to be circumcised, that might be some of what's going on, that people are putting pressure on them to adopt Jewish ways so they stay under that umbrella. Because as soon as they step out from under that umbrella of being Jewish, none of the exceptions apply. And all of a sudden they're expected to do these sacrifices, they can't assemble, can't do all these things. They have a chance to prove they're not a Christian or to repent of being a Christian by offering a sacrificial rite to a pagan god. And usually it's like many rounds. It is interesting because it's not always the case with these, Roman authorities that they find out someone's a Christian and they just want the guy dead. It wasn't quite as genocidal as all that. Like, again, thinking about the Nazi analogy where they're Jewish and like, hey, we just want to get rid of you. That wasn't the Romans' interest. The Roman interest wasn't in destroying the Christians per se, even though sometimes selectively that was the case. It was that they wanted to turn them. They wanted to make them loyal subjects again. And so they send them back and forth to prison. They would torture them. Sometimes they torture them trying to compel a confession of the crimes. That was kind of a little bit of a different thing, I think, than just getting them to comply to sacrifice. Now, what's interesting is that on the sidelines of all this, so all of this is public, it's a public happening. You'd have Christians on the sidelines basically trying to be like, yeah, go stick, basically like stick up for yourself, hold steady. And in some of these accounts, you see like that the Roman governor notices or some other authority notices and they say, hey, you, like, are you a Christian? And they basically drag you up on stage and like now you're in the same position as them. And this is how a lot of people also end up dying. And then there's also Christians and of course non-Christians, especially relatives, but there's Christians even on the sidelines encouraging you to give in. And you hear about this especially later on where there's like priests, there's bishops even who've given in to sacrificing and they're encouraging you to give in. And imagine that, imagine you, as just, a regular lay person in the church. And let's say I've given in to sacrifice and they're like, come on, Jody, just do the sacrifice. Pastor Tom did it. Like, why are you being such a stick in the mud? Basically, just give in. Lots of pressure, especially when you know what's going to come if you don't give in. Now, one important development that happened was in 124 AD. There was an amendment introduced by Emperor Hadrian, which basically required punishment for false accusations. Now, this is very interesting because basically it said that if you reported someone as a Christian and they proved not to be a Christian, then you would be punished yourself. Now think about that. You would have to report someone being pretty confident that they wouldn't give in to the torture and the threats of death and that they'd hold steady. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to make any bets on that. And so for that reason, some of this reporting declined because people are like, oh, gee, that's way too risky now. Now I can't just get even with a person. You could see kind of the motivation before where if you really disliked someone, report them to the authorities. But now it might come back on you if they're not as solid as they might appear.
Do you know if their punishment would be death or something?
That was what I wasn't sure of. I did a double check on that. It didn't say what the punishment was, but it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, and some of this can depend too on whether they're a Roman citizen. If they're not, there's a lot of class differentiation in terms of the punishments that you receive. Maybe they just get whipped or something. I don't know. Later on in 249 AD, in terms of expecting people to offer sacrifices, this was an empire-wide program. People were expected to produce a certificate certifying that they did, in fact, offer this sacrifice. So, it gets cranked up later on in terms of making sure everyone's actually done this. So, in terms of how that all actually played out, many Christians actually complied. And so they became what's known as apostate. And this is why, we don't have any firm numbers on how many people were killed throughout all of this. But it's not as high as maybe you might think because so many people folded. And I was really struck by that when it was reported in the things I was reading that bishops even gave in. There was those who stayed faithful in the face of this process, but didn't suffer consequences. So again, like there were some places where they like dragged you up. They found out you were a Christian, and maybe like we really don't like that, and maybe put a little bit of pressure on you. But ultimately, they just release you, and nothing happens to you. No torture, none of that. Then there was those who stayed faithful, suffered, but did not die, and they became known as confessors. So if you're ever looking at, in our tradition, we don't attend too much to saints, but if you ever hear about anyone from church history who's got that term confessor attached to their name, that means that they were basically tortured for the faith, but they weren't killed. And then, of course, there were those who stayed faithful and died, and they became known as martyrs. Some of the methods of torture that were employed, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find really any pictures for any of these devices. But we can imagine that they're probably pretty brutal. Originally, torture was limited to slaves until 177 AD, although there's always exceptions to all the rules. Christians were often whipped, sometimes with leaden balls, which were called plubetai, which you imagine hurt, probably bruised, probably broke bones. They got clubbed. They had this thing called a horse rack. It's called an equilis, and I was really trying hard to get a picture of this, and I couldn't. There's like a medieval version of this, but it's a totally different way of torturing people. The description I said, it made it sound like you're almost like under this wooden horse, and they're stretching your limbs. Basically, they're pulling all your limbs out of socket. And then they had this thing called iron claws, which I think is about what it sounds like. They rip you apart with iron claws. Now, just picking up on just this method that the Romans were employing, the injustice of this, Tertullian says, to others who deny their guilt, you apply torture to force them to confess. So saying like, okay, if you're guilty of a crime, or if you think someone's guilty of a crime, you'll torture them to get them to admit to it. To Christians alone, to force them to deny. See how it's kind of a perverted twist on that? They're torturing people to deny the fact that they're a Christian. Some of the capital punishments that were employed, so once they've gone through all the torturing, they say, okay, we're just going to kill this person. You had crucifixion, which was actually kind of rare as you're going along, even though Nero did some of that. You have burning at the stake, which interestingly you think that the person dies primarily by actually being burnt up, but they would often die initially just by the smoke inhalation. So much smoke coming up, they'd die. You probably would prefer that, having to literally be burnt to death for you to literally die. Beheading, which was the best way to die. And usually Roman citizens had a right to that. Paul, he was a Roman citizen, that's why he's beheaded. Drowning, there's this one instance at least where it says they tied up a man in a sack with a dog and a snake and threw him in the ocean or river, and that's how they put him to death. And then you had the fun-fair executions, which are the ones that are most notorious, where you send Christians into gladiatorial combat, have them fight or be fed to wild beasts, which is in the Latin is called damnatio ad bestias. So they'd fight lions, panthers, bears, boars, bulls. It was interesting to see how many times bulls came up, because you don't really think of that as being an animal that would kill people, even though you can see how dangerous they could be when they're bullfighting and stuff. But commonly had them face bulls. This is a mosaic, a really gruesome mosaic of someone fighting the beast. It looks like a leopard biting the guy's face off. And then there was other sentences. You had property confiscation. That would usually happen if you're upper class. They take all your property. You would also be demoted too, oftentimes. Might be sent into exile. That wouldn't be unusual for an upper class woman to just be sent into exile. You'd be sent to work mines, like copper mines, really brutal work. Probably die from that. Women would be sent to brothels. Sometimes you'd have women that had committed themselves to a life of virginity, basically like early versions of nuns, though they weren't quite nuns at that point, be sent to brothels. And then there was time for, again, like I said before, there's people who are just released. They went through this whole process and they're like, all right, we're done with you. So now what I want to do is dip into some of these, this is the point where we're jumping out of the balloon onto the ground, look at some of these stories. You have Justin's martyrdom. So we heard about Justin Martyr earlier. Very eloquent guy, wrote these books, made philosophical arguments for the faith. Ultimately, he faced a brutal death himself. So we have this dialogue between him and the prefect Rusticus, and I believe this happens in Rome. And supposedly it came to a head. He came into conflict with some Roman philosopher, and it basically led to him being brought before the government. And the prefect says to him, approach and sacrifice all of you to the gods. There's others with Justin as well who are being tried. Justin says, no one in his right mind gives up piety for impiety. And the prefect says, if you do not obey, you will be tortured without mercy. And Justin replies, that is our desire, to be tortured for our Lord Jesus Christ, and so to be saved, for that will give us salvation and firm confidence at the more terrible universal tribunal of our Lord and Savior. And all the martyrs said, do as you wish, for we are Christians, and we do not sacrifice to idols. The prefect read the sentence, those who do not wish to sacrifice to the gods and to obey the emperor will be scourged and beheaded according to the laws. The holy martyrs, glorifying God, took themselves to the customary place where they were beheaded and consummated their martyrdom by confessing their Savior. Really interesting to see kind of their boldness there. They really did truly see this as, even though, I think we can be assured that Justin didn't want to die per se, but at the same time he saw it as a great honor. And in fact, there's points, I think it was in one account, I think it's the account of Polycarp, where they talk about basically dissuading people from seeking martyrdom, because the Christians so much venerated those who met this kind of terrible end, who remained faithful, that some people kind of got twisted in their minds and said, like, I want to go out that way too. Kind of like, I don't want to just die in bed. I want to be, executed, go out kind of a flame of glory kind of thing. And the Christian leader said, no, you're not supposed to do that. Partly because sometimes when people did that, it wouldn't turn out how they thought. They start getting tortured and stuff, and then they'd flip and they would deny the faith. Speaking of Polycarp, which actually came earlier, Polycarp's an interesting fellow because he was a disciple of John the Apostle. And so, especially with some of these early people, before 200 AD, you're talking about people that were either, disciples of the apostles or disciples of the apostles. So really in close proximity to the original apostles. And you can see the domino effect. Jesus went to the cross. The apostles faced torture and gruesome deaths themselves, and now their disciples are willing to do the same. And this just keeps carrying on forward like a domino effect. Polycarp here, he's like 84, so he's been around for a while, but he's finally getting dragged before the authorities. And this happens in Izmir, Turkey. They tried to get him to deny the faith. They say, respect your age. He said, swear by the divine power of Caesar, change your mind, say away with the atheists. Again, that charge of atheism. But Polycarp, with a solemn look at the unruly mob in the stadium, pointing to them and looking up to heaven, said, away with the atheists. So you love kind of Polycarp's spunk. He's got all these people in the stadium looking at him, and he says, away with the atheists. Proconsul urged him harder, take the oath and I'll let you go. Curse Christ. And he says, 86 years, I guess he's 86 years old. I have served him, and he never did me any wrong, said Polycarp. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And when the proconsul kept insisting, he says, swear by the divine power of Caesar. Polycarp answered, if you vainly suppose that I will swear by the divine power of Caesar, as you say, and if you pretend that you do not know who I am, listen plainly. I am a Christian. Again, that's the refrain that comes up again and again. I am a Christian. If you wish to learn the Christian message, arrange a meeting, give me a hearing. And then the proconsul says, I have wild animals. I'll throw you to them unless you change your mind. And Polycarp replies, call them in, for we are not allowed to change from something better to something worse. Scorn the wild beasts, and I'll have you burned alive if you don't change your mind. Polycarp said, you threaten me with fire that burns for a short time and is soon quenched. You don't know about the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment that awaits the wicked. But why are you waiting? Come, do what you will. And so that's what they do to him. Originally, they threatened to feed him to a lion. They decided they're not going to do that. They just burned him at the stake. And supposedly, it took a very long time for him actually to burn up, which seemed to be an indication. They took, at least in the Christian tradition, they take that as some sort of divine sign. But yeah, again, very interesting to think about, people gathering to watch this happen, someone being burned to death. And it's very easy for us to kind of be like, how could anyone possibly do that? But you have to remember this too. Like, it's not so far back in our history that public executions was something that people would gather to see. And in fact, when we're looking at the broad swath of history, we're actually the weird ones. And in fact, it was very common for people, be like, okay, talking about the Christian world even, go to church on Sunday, Saturday they're hanging the horse thief. Let's all gather to see this happen, Very strange to us, but that's the world that they lived in, and they thought it was totally acceptable. And in their minds, these people were criminals. They were traitors to the state, basically. You have a group of martyrs in Lyons. I think when I was reading that, it made it sound like thousands of people were swept up in this, but there's only some select stories told here. And this is the big question, with all of this, you're covering all of this history. Obviously, not everyone makes it into the history book. So there's all kinds of stories that are untold. These are the only stories. These are just the stories that are told. And this one in particular is really brutal. It's instigated by riot. So again, it's not just a governmental thing. The Christians are truly unpopular. They're charged with feasting and banquets. There's this, I don't know if it's a myth or a legend of someone basically feeding a human to his guests secretly, like making this feast and then secretly feeding them a human being. And so, again, thinking about the Lord's Supper, that's why they charge them with that. And then incestuous orgies, like I was saying earlier, love feasts, brothers and sisters. You have someone this guy, Vettius Epagathus, he volunteers a defense. He's not even dragged up there to be charged like these other people, but he kind of stands up as like a voluntary lawyer. And then he gets implicated as a Christian. The prefect's basically like, you seem awfully fond of these people. Are you one yourself? And he gets implicated. Again, one of these people that offers signals of encouragement, he gets implicated as well. You have a deacon sanctus. You have someone who's newly baptized, Maturus, a fellow named Attalus, Blandina, a slave girl, and Biblis. And Biblis is interesting because originally she denies the faith when under torture, but then she changes her mind and decides she'll go a second round, basically, and stays faithful. I can't remember if it was Attalus or it might have been Sanctus. They took like red hot flakes of iron and like put it on his body to try to get him to confess to the things that they were charging them of. And they succeeded, but then they ended up saying, no, actually, we didn't do any of those things. So you can tell like it's a really messy process and a really twisted process to try to just go off these public rumors and get people to admit to these things. I mean, who wouldn't admit to those things if they're putting hot pieces of metal to you? They were put in dungeons, and by being all stuffed in the dungeon, some of them died from asphyxiation. This is one of the scenarios where they use the horse rack to torture people. It's interesting because some of the people who did basically admit to, being cannibals and having orgies and stuff, the governor is basically like, all right, you admit to that, so we're going to put you to death because you're admitting to be a cannibal. And then they're like, wait, no. So then when the other Christians hear them basically saying they're going to get the same treatment anyways, it kind of emboldens them. They're like, we have nothing to lose then. In the end, the apostates are actually released. But at least initially, at one point in these proceedings, they're going to have the same outcome.
Did you say apostates are people who admit to doing wrong?
Who basically deny the faith. Yeah. The interesting thing in this scenario is they're charged with being Christians, which is crime enough, but then they also have these additional charges of being cannibals and engaging in orgies. So these people are broadly put to death by flogging, fighting wild beasts, and then this is the only case I heard about this. They said that they had this iron chair that they roast people in. It's brutal. And Attalus from the iron chair, it says that he yells to the crowd this. He says, "You see, what you do is to eat humans. We do not eat humans and do nothing else wicked." And it is kind of poignant, you think about, like, they're all so concerned about these Christians and supposedly the things that they're doing that they can't see their own barbarism and what they're doing to these people. Some of the bodies are exposed to make an example of once they're dead. They burn up the bodies and scatter them in the Rhine because they don't want people venerating them. That's something that's kind of lost on us, but what would often happen, once all this went down, is some of the Christians would gather the remains, and it kind of served as a point of kind of rallying the troops. And this is what kind of leads to a lot of the prayers to the saints that we see develop later on in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. It begins here. And you can understand why these people would be like, these are basically Christian superheroes to them. And so they want to cling on to a part of that because it seems powerful to them. And the Romans don't want any of that. And so they're like, we're casting your remains to the wind so you can't get any kind of following. So the known victims from this was 22 beheaded, 6 died in the arena, and then 19 died in prison. And that's an actual picture of that arena. And you can see it's not a huge kind of arena. It's not like sitting in the nosebleeds at Gillette and seeing all this play out. You're very close, close by seeing someone get roasted in an iron chair. It's just crazy. And this is Blandina. She was cast to the bulls. And then we have the martyrs of Carthage. This is 197 AD. A lot of these things, like I've been referencing, happened during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, so a really brutal time during the reign of this philosopher king. In this case, you have the stories of these two women, Perpetua and Felicitas, highlighted. And what's striking about them is they're both, one of them is an especially young woman, 22 years old. Both of them are mothers. Perpetua has a newborn, and Felicitas is pregnant when they drag her in. Now, Roman law doesn't allow you to execute a pregnant woman. But 2 days before they're due to be executed, she gives birth. And so they decide, okay, we can execute her now. And Perpetua's father, not a Christian, is begging her to please just, sacrifice to the gods. Your baby needs you. Not going to survive without you. But she refuses. And what's especially striking about her is that she's kind of an upper class lady. And so she's leaving all this behind to be left to the bulls. It says that they wrap them. It's not accurately depicted here because it'd be too gruesome to depict it, but it says that they're basically put in fishing nets naked and cast to these bulls. And that even for the crowds that are accustomed to all this bloody sport, they were even put off a little bit by it. There's another fellow in the mix here. He's named Satyrus, and he was fed to a leopard, and he's all bloody from this leopard. And the crowds cry out this saying that they would say when a person went to the baths, the Roman baths, these public baths. They said, "Well bathed." Just brutal comments. And then I think this is the last little vignette I'm going to share with you, just because it's a unique one. You have this, it's called the Pogrom of Alexandria. And what's interesting about this is it's just chaotic persecution. It's not a governmental trial and all that playing out. I just quote directly from Wolfram Kinzig here. He says, a pagan mob engaged in large-scale, I'm supposed to say, looting of Christian houses. Christians who declined to recant or sacrifice in the temple were tortured and murdered. The elderly Metris was beaten up, his eyes were gouged out, and he was stoned to death. When Quinta the Christian refused to offer a sacrifice in the temple, she was dragged through the city by her feet, scourged, and similarly stoned to death. The elderly virgin Apollonia had her teeth knocked out and was threatened with burning at the stake unless she recanted, but she instead willingly jumped into the bonfire that had already been lit. A certain Serapion was severely tortured in his house and then thrown out the window. So from the highest authorities just to the people in the streets, there's this will to persecute the Christians. Like I was saying before, we later on have some empire-wide policies introduced under Decius and Valerian. Those are the first ones that we see. Again, presentation of these certificates that they offered sacrifice. Everyone had to sacrifice, even children, even infants. They'd make them come up and eat some of the sacrificial meat. So imagine what position that puts you in as a parent. Like if you're a Christian parent, and you're like, first of all, you don't want to abandon your kids. And then maybe you're like in a position like, oh, I'll leave my kid to my grandparents or something. I'm not going to deny the faith. But not, and the government says, no, your kid has to take it too. It's like, what do you do then? This is why so many people gave in. It was just so much pressure. Church leaders were immediately executed. They really started to aim for the head of the snake in their mind, really going after church leaders. And so, but then after this period, from 260 to 303, there was a large period of peace, starting with this emperor called Gallienus. And churches were built. It's just the church really started to thrive. So kind of a striking departure from the past. But then it was all of a sudden things changed drastically under the policy of the Diocletian Tetrarchy. Now, what Tetrarchy means is there's basically 4 imperial rulers. It's a little bit complicated, but basically Diocletian decided the best way to handle the affairs of the empire so that things are sustainable, you don't have civil wars and stuff, is to have kind of a farm system of emperors. So he said, I'll take the East, because the East was most wealthy at this time. And he said, I'll take the East. And then he gave the West to the Maximian. And then underneath them, they have Caesars. So under Diocletian, you have Galerius, and then under Maximian, you have Constantius. And Constantius ruled this area of Gaul and Britain. And Constantius is the father of Constantine. That's going to be important to remember in a second. So they divide the empire like this, and they introduce some imperial edicts against Christians. Doesn't all play out equally in all the different parts. It's especially brutal, though, in the East. A lot of times, like, we think of just everything happening in Rome, but the East is a really important part of the Roman Empire, and that's where a lot of the pressure is put. Now, before the Christians were persecuted, you have this group called the Manichaeans. They were persecuted, and they were kind of a blend of, like, Christianity and this religion called Zoroastrianism and Buddhism. a weird kind of like philosophical religion. And again, the Romans do not like novelty. And so they started going after them first. And then they turned their attention to the Christians. And under this first edict that they issued, church buildings were destroyed. Again, the Christians that actually managed to build some infrastructure at this point. Early on, when the first church was first starting, they were just meeting at homes. But now they have church buildings. They have books. They're saying those books have to be burned. Christian office holders are removed from office. And then if you were in the imperial household and you were a free man, you were made a slave. Galerius especially has this like vendetta against the Christians, and so he sets Diocletian's palace on fire and pins it on the Christians, and that leads to like a mass execution of some priests. Under the second edict, all the clergy are jailed. The third edict, prisoners can be released if they sacrifice under threat of torture. And again, like I said, there was a great deal of Christian compliance at this point. This is where you especially see some of the reports of bishops giving in, priests giving in. And in the fourth edict, you have mandated general sacrifice. So originally, a lot of this was focused on Christian leadership, but then it's just a general populist sort of thing. But like I said at the beginning, there's inconsistent implementation. You look at a guy like Conscientius, and in his realm, like up in Britain, in modern day France, they pretty much limited things to destroying the buildings. And then like everything else, he's like, I don't have time for this. And he can kind of get away with that because you got to remember, like they didn't have email. They couldn't just call each other on the phone. You'd have to send a messenger, and like, how are they going to monitor? Like, there's just all kind of technical issues, which makes it really easy for each of them to kind of do what they want to a certain degree. And so for him, he kind of just did the bare minimum, which kind of explains the reversal that we see. So Conscientius had kind of this easy hand towards the Christians, and he had this son named Constantine. Now he has a different name that's very long, but that's the name that we all know him by, Constantine. And he's known as the first Christian emperor. And the way that all comes about is he wrests control of the empire with his fellow Licinius. And this all comes about at the Battle of Milvian Bridge as he's going towards Rome. And he basically calls on, he receives this vision where basically that the God of the Christians will be with him if he conquers by the sign of the Cairo, which stands for Christ, and he puts that all on their shields. And so they're victorious, and so he's very pro-Christian. Now, before this, I will back up. I think his name was Galenius, perhaps, in 311. The temperature had dropped down as far as Christians go. They had begun to become intolerant. In fact, Galenius, I think, again, it might be Galerius. I think it's Galenius, though. Very similar names. He was very sick, and he actually asked the Christians to please pray for him. He still died. But by the time you get to 313, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which introduces official toleration of Christianity. So kind of a situation of going from 60 to 0, like things are really hot, and then boom. Again, he's the first Christian emperor, kind of a strange guy because he doesn't get baptized until his deathbed. They had some kind of weird notions that if you waited to the very end to be baptized, it was more effective. And so kind of that's why we put Christian in quotes, because he's kind of straddling that line between paganism and Christianity. During the Diocletian persecution, this is coming from Kinzig's estimates. He says about 3,500, and that's a pretty conservative estimate. So not like crazy high numbers, but again, that makes an impact on the churches when they see some of their priests being put to death and their church buildings being destroyed, books being burned, and the book burning was a really big deal because they didn't have printing presses. Those are very prized objects. I'll touch on that a little bit more in just a second. Right now, so we went back to like the mid I think it was like 170 AD when I gave you the figure for there being 100,000 Christians. Now you have 5 million Christians. Still not, we have to assume here that the Roman Empire's population grew as well, so it's probably larger than 60 million, but still 5 million out of 60 million isn't the whole empire. Still a minority within the empire, but a sizable minority. They've got 65,000 churches at this point. Interestingly, later on, you have this emperor called Julian the Apostate. The reason why they call him an apostate is because he was brought up in a Christian household, and he decides, actually, I'd like to go back to the pagan gods. And he says, I kind of like some of the charitable work that Christians do, and we're going to do that as pagans. And so he kind of tried to blend the two together, and he wanted to kind of introduce a renaissance of pagan religion. He failed. And by the time you get to 380 AD, you have the Edict of Thessalonica under Emperor Theodosius I, making Christianity the official religion. I just think about how quickly things have turned. 80 years, you're talking about basically 70 years before this. Buildings are being torn down, people are being put to death. 70 years later, it's the official religion of the empire. A crazy 180-degree turnaround. And this kind of really quick change has some ramifications for the life of the church. One basic question is, what do you do with the apostates? Those who faltered in the face of persecution. Because you had such an intense period and then such a quick change, you've got these people in your pews. You have people that are priests and bishops who faltered, who surrendered the books. And again, that was a big deal. You surrender the books. So when are you going to get another book? It's a long process to copy by hand. And the whole congregation is depending on you, because not everyone could just look at that book at will. It was dependent on the bishop, or they would have lectors reading the text so everyone could hear it. You take that away, everyone suffers. So it's a really big betrayal. So what do you do with them? And this got messy because we talked about confessors before, those who were tortured for the faith, weren't killed, but were tortured and stood strong. Some of these people offered forgiveness to the apostates. And you could see how they would kind of be in an authoritative position to do that because, they got tortured. So if they can forgive them, I guess the rest of us have to forgive them. But this kind of put some of the bishops who maybe weren't confessors in a difficult position, because all of a sudden you have these people who aren't in church positions officially forgiving people and restoring people. And so it just introduces some chaos. And there's this group called the Donatists who are very strict about this, and they didn't feel like anyone who capitulated could be let back in the church. And they said, basically, if you were a bishop or a priest that betrayed the church and surrendered books and all of this, basically any pastoral duties that you did, like let's say you baptized somebody, doesn't count. Person has to get rebaptized. Now, St. Augustine pushed back against it, and he says the power is not in the priest or the bishop. The power is in the grace of the gospel and of the sacraments themselves, which is a really big development. Eventually, the Donatist sect passed away. Also, it raises the question about the relationship between church and state. Although at this point, it really wasn't a question. It was just an assumption. Think about what happened. The empire just made Christianity the official religion of the empire. And it became the empire's policy to introduce Christianity wherever the realm would go. Because the same logic remained. If before they thought the welfare of the empire depended on serving the pagan gods, now they believed the welfare of the empire depended on serving the Christian God. So the same national security concerns, but now cast in a Christian frame. And this pretty much carries onward until you get basically to the United States. All the European nations operated under this mindset. Now, I think even in America today, we can see some of the practical concerns that the Romans had when it came to religion, because we do live in a very diverse society now, and we can see how religious commitments are coming at odds with one another, and we live in a very kind of divided sort of society. And so there was some merit to those concerns, but also the gospel indicates, Jesus indicates that religion is not compulsory. You don't lead anyone to Christ by the point of a sword. But that, they didn't figure that out. They kind of lost sight of that for a long while. And instead, they kind of continued on with the imperial program of expecting everyone's got to step in line with what the religion of the state is. Another question for the faith is, what happens when the faith is now socially advantageous? Or to get ahead, you ought to be a member of the church. Very different from, how do you, before, for someone to be a bishop, that was putting your life on the line because you became, public enemy number one, basically. Now, though, it's like becoming a senator. And it's in this later period that you see the bishops starting to get distinct dress. Before, they just wore dress like everyone else did, but now they kind of step into that almost like senator class. And then the broader question for just your regular Christian was, how do you emulate the martyrs without the threat of persecution? You have these Christian superheroes, but now there are no more threats of being, thrown to the animals. One of the solutions that they came up with was adopting an ascetic lifestyle. That is, going out into the desert. Now, they were doing that kind of stuff before this, but it became especially prevalent. Basically, if the state wasn't going to bring suffering upon them, they were going to bring suffering upon themselves so that they could be just as radical as the martyrs by putting themselves in these kind of perilous situations. Some of them did that, again, by going out into the wilderness and becoming hermits, basically. Others, though, you could find that just as easily by becoming a missionary, because their Christian persecution continued on among those who served as missionaries going into among the Germanic tribes. Think about St. Patrick going to Ireland. But that was some of the questions that they were wrestling with.